Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mr. Walker's Apes. Today we're going to be talking about community ecology, and this is a large part of the ecology unit that we're going to be studying. So you can see here in the subtext that we're going to be looking at structure, interactions, and a little bit on sustainability today. Alright, as we move into some of the more difficult stuff and transition out of what we've been talking about with the living systems and kind of a earth science review. I'm going to start including objectives, and at the end you have a review with questions. Alright, so today by the end of the video you should know and be able to answer questions about where species are found and why, the types of species that could be found in an area. Now I'm not looking for specific, this is types, okay, and we're going to learn about the different types, and you should be able to answer questions about the way that species interact and why species even interact at all. Okay, so this might seem simple, and some of these questions you might already be able to answer, but in AP we have to go in depth, and so there's a lot more to each of these than I think you might think. Alright, so first, where are species found and why? So there are several different places that species can be found, and then, of course, there is the reason why they're found there. Obviously, their anatomy and physiology will determine most likely where they are found, and then, of course, they will have certain competitive advantages or disadvantages that force them to certain areas. Okay, so you can see, physical appearance, that's physiology, okay? The way that something, either the land looks or the way that the species looks, has them adapted to a certain area. For example, you're not going to find something that is bright pink in an Arctic area because they would stand out against the snow and be easy prey. So everything in the Arctic is generally white, as you probably already know. Okay. Also, the peacock, it lives in the jungle. The males are very bright and colorful, and that helps them find mates, so they stand out against the background jungle, and that's what they want. Okay, edges. Edges, what we're talking about there is, where forest meets grassland, or tundra meets taiga, those sorts of things. And some organisms hate edges. They will not go near an edge because they feel vulnerable, or it doesn't have the resources that they need on the edge and only in the middle of the forest. Whereas others love the edges because they like being able to go, hide in the forest but eat on the grassland. Deer are like that. You see deer around the edges of forest quite a bit because they like to eat the grasses and things out of people's gardens. And then they can always run back to the safety of the forest if they need to. Here's an important one, okay? Island biogeography. Alright, this is a term that comes up quite a bit. It is something that the College Board loves to test your knowledge of. And it's a very simple process, okay? Let's say that you have a chain of islands off somewhere. Okay, so if I've got Island 1, Island 2, Island 3, I'll put another island right there, okay? And my mainland is the edge of the words, and these are all little islands off the coast. Island biogeography says that islands will have fewer species in general than a large landmass like a continent, which tends to be true. And that the further away the island is, the fewer the species, and the smaller the island, the fewer the species. Okay? So let me say it again. If I have my continent here, the continent will have more species than any of these islands. Then, this island out here, because it's the furthest away from the mainland, will have fewer species than this island, because it's closer. However, if comparing two islands of the same distance, the smaller island will have fewer species. Okay? So a lot of times you'll see either a chart, which we'll practice with, where they're giving you island distance versus size, and they're going to ask you to pick the one with the fewest or most species. Or they'll give you a diagram, similar to this, of course, on a real map, and say which one has the most or the fewest species. Okay, so keep that in mind, island biogeography. Okay, pollution will affect where species are found. Most definitely. All right. When we get to the pollution unit, we're going to do a lot on how pollution affects species. But for now, just know that some species are pollution tolerant, meaning they can live in pollution, and others are not pollution tolerant. They're pollution intolerant. So they will move out at the slightest hint of pollution. Examples of these are most common among fish. There are some fish, like the rainbow trout, that is completely intolerant of pollution. So as soon as you pollute those nice, clean waters of the Pacific Northwest, you're going to lose your rainbow trout. Whereas catfish and mudsuckers and crabs, things of that sort, are very pollution tolerant generally, and they will stick around for a while, and because they can build up the pollution in their bodies, it doesn't kill them. Vegetation, of course, affects it. Not just in terms of food or shelter, but generally, the larger the variety of vegetation, the more species you'll find in the area. So if we look at this area where we've got primarily oak, maple, elm trees and pine trees in the forests, we generally don't have a lot of species that you can think of. We have, some bats and some deer and some rats and things of that sort. But if you compare Maryland's forests to those of the rainforest, the difference is huge. And a lot of it is because of the difference in vegetation. The rainforest has a huge biodiversity of vegetation versus our area. And of course, latitude. Okay, latitude affects a lot of things. When you look at latitude, that is, going north to south on the Earth. Around the equator, you have high solar intensity. Sun shines there a lot between the tropics. And you're going to have more rain there because of the temperature swings, because of the Coriolis effect. And so you've got all these things happening in those areas with higher temperature, higher rainfall, leads to higher vegetation, which leads to higher biodiversity, which leads to all these other things. And you also tend to have fewer edges in the rainforest. You'll see a rainforest that stretches across large areas without very many edges. Although the edges are increasing because of rainforest deforestation. Okay, so that's where we can find species. I think some of these maybe seem more obvious. We're going to get more into pollution. Keep in mind the island biogeography. And the rest of these, I think you could maybe figure out, even if you just needed a few explained to you. So types of species. There are 4 major types of species: native, non-native, or invasive, indicator species, and keystone species. Okay. So native is exactly what it sounds like. Species that are endemic, well, not necessarily endemic, but live in that area exclusively, or native to an area. Native species. Okay, like Native Americans. They were here, and they've been there for a long time, and now Europeans came in. Europeans would be non-native, exotic, or alien species to North America. So, yeah, they just normally thrive in the area. An endemic species is a species that is only from that area and can live nowhere else. So there's a difference between native and endemic. A lot of times people, even I, almost confuse the words. A native species could become a non-native species, whereas an endemic species cannot become an exotic species because they have to have the certain areas. Okay, an example in Maryland, there's these old shale barrens in Maryland which have a unique geology and topography which lead to endemic species. And every region of the world has something like that, where there's something about that particular region that they can only live there. The redwood forests in California, for example, exists nowhere else in the world, so you've got a lot of endemic species in there. Okay, non-native, exotic, or alien species, all those terms will be used to describe the same type of species, which is one that has either accidentally or deliberately been put into an ecosystem. And could be for positive effect or negative effect. And you probably already know of some alien species. How about, I'm going to talk about one in particular, but let's talk about some in Maryland or the East Coast. Phragmites. Anybody ever heard of Phragmites? Hopefully that rings a bell. Phragmites is the really tall, skinny grass that you see around a lot of waterways. It grows really thick. That's an invasive species, and it grows almost anywhere. Or kudzu. Okay, kudzu doesn't really come into Maryland very much, but if you go anywhere south of here, especially into North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, kudzu has pretty much taken over. It's a vine that crawls over all the trees and kills them off by smothering them. Kudzu was originally brought here from China or Japan, I believe, as a way to feed cattle, and it just got out of control. So the invasive species I want to talk about is one that's very interesting, the killer bee. The Africanized bee is really what it's called, the Africanized honeybee, and it's sometimes called the killer bee because they are extremely aggressive. Now, all honeybees are poisonous, but normally if you the European honeybee, if you go near it, it probably won't sting you unless you really piss it off. But if you do get stung, it's poisonous, and that's why some people are allergic. However, the Africanized honeybee, if you make them angry, will really come after you, and they are known to chase people for miles and miles. Originally, there was the African honeybee, which lived in Africa and collected honey, not as well, but was really aggressive. The European honeybee is really good at collecting honey, but is not that aggressive. So they wanted to combine the two to see if they could basically double the honey production by making them very aggressive and really, really going after all the honey. So, in I think the late 1956, it was when it was introduced in the wild, and Brazilian scientists were attempting to create a new hybrid in order to improve honey production, like I said. Okay, so it escaped from the laboratory, and here's how it has spread. I know this, you probably can't read the text at all, but just look at the lines. Okay, so this is Brazil, here is this whole country in South America, and right here's where it was released in 1956, that little dot, and then the first little circle is 1957, 58, 59, 60, 61. Okay, so you can see it started to radiate out, and it started moving up, and right now it's in the southwest United States. It has not really moved up much more than that. What do you think is the limiting factor, looking at this map, is the limiting factor for this species? What keeps it from moving any further north or south? Think about where species can live and and the things that keep species in check. Okay. Types of species continued. Indicator species. These are species that give early warnings as to damage to an ecosystem. So this could be the rainbow trout, okay? If the rainbow trout is pollution sensitive and all the rainbow trout leave, so when the scientists go back and survey the area and they don't find any rainbow trout, then they probably will suspect that something is wrong, okay? And they might start to investigate and figure out what might have changed since the last time that they did their survey. Usually these are amphibians, okay? Salamanders, frogs, newts, those sorts of things. Just because they absorb their oxygen through their skin, and when they absorb things through their skin, they're absorbing other things as well, like chemicals, and so they're very sensitive to those. Generally, for terrestrial, there's not too many that I know of, because terrestrial just kind of move around a lot more freely than aquatic organisms, and but there are indicators that show some things are changing. Like with deforestation, you might see animals running away, those sorts of things from noise. So then you've got the last type of species, the keystone species. And these are ones that are so important to an ecosystem that if they were to leave the ecosystem or be killed off from that ecosystem, it is likely the ecosystem will collapse. Okay, so I've got the elephant here as an example. They eat a lot of food, they produce a lot of dung, and that is important for those ecosystems. They keep the vegetation in check. And without the elephant, the vegetation would overrun everything, and then the lions wouldn't be able to hunt, the gazelles wouldn't be able to run, etc. So the entire ecosystem may collapse. Here's another one. Okay, little prairie dog. Okay, out in the western United States. Really annoying for farmers because they dig holes all over the place and eat their crops, but they are a keystone species. They create homes for other things, and without loosening the soil by digging all those holes, then the plants wouldn't be able to grow as well, so the farmers would actually probably suffer. Now, of course, we have machinery that overtakes that and makes it easier, but, if you're talking about a natural ecosystem, the grasslands would not be able to take hold as well without the prairie dog. They're also a food source for every single predator in the area, so important source of energy for them. Another one off the coast of Washington, the sea otter. Sea otter keeps the seaweed in check. If you don't keep the seaweed in check, then the seaweed overtakes everything and chokes out everything else, and so ultimately everything dies. So lastly, interactions between species. These are words that I hope you heard in biology. I hope that you remember some of them, so I'm just going to do a really brief review of each of these. Obviously, there is competition between species. And then, of course, there's predators and prey, mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. So we're going to go into each of these. So competition. There are two types of competition. There's intraspecific and interspecific. Intra, anytime you see intra, that means between something of the same. Okay, so intraspecific competitions between two organisms of the same species. For example, you and your brother last night at dinner, there was one steak left. You fought over it. That is intraspecific competition, so you were fighting over food. Interspecific competition is competition between two different species. So maybe there was one different steak left, and while you and your brother were doing intraspecific competition, the dog jumped up on the table and decided he wanted it. Now it is a competition between you and the dog. Now it's interspecific competition. Alright, you can keep those visuals in your head to remember the difference for those of you who are imaginative people. Alright, so what do organisms of the same species compete for? Food, mate, space, shelter, nutrients, and territory. Can we sum this up into one word? What's one word that would encompass food, mate, space, shelter, nutrients, and territory? There's a question in the review about it. I give you the first letter. I think once you see the first letter, you will get it. Okay, but obviously we want to compete for food, even within the same species. Okay, I want to live, the heck with you. If it's a bunch of people, we're stranded in a bunker after nuclear war. Some people will show compassion. Eventually people will start starving. You're going to compete for food. For mates, oh yes, this is a big one in high school, right? Oh man, all the competition to get the best girl, the best boy. It drives me nuts, but yes, there is competition. Even if you're not mating, which you definitely should not be, you're competing for that girlfriend or boyfriend. And this happens all the way up into adulthood at colleges and bars all around the world. All right, space. Everybody wants to have their own space. Everybody wants to have more of it. This is especially important for wild species. They need to have space to hunt, They need to have space and territory. Space and territory are essentially go hand in hand. Some species need lots of it, some species don't need much. Shelter. Shelter is one of the essential things for all species to survive. Without shelter, all species will die of exposure. So some make their own shelter, like some spiders will make their own little webs as shelter. Humans make their own shelter. Other animals live in caves or build holes. And some grow shelter. They have really, really, really thick fur or something that protects them. Nutrients, that can kind of go with food, okay? But when I mean nutrients, I'm talking about things that maybe you don't get through your food, like salt. A lot of times you'll see farmers put out salt licks for horses because they don't get enough salt in their food, so they go and they lick the salt, and that's an essential nutrient. And of course, territory. Lions go around and spray large areas of the savanna as territory, noting to others that this is theirs. This is where they hunt. This is where they mate. This is where their kids are. If you come into their territory, you will have to put up a fight for your life. Humans do this to some extent. You have your room, and if anybody comes in there, you go berserk. Okay, but generally we're not too territorial. Very similar. What do different species compete for? The only difference here is sunlight and hiding spots. And the difference there is sunlight for plants, obviously. And so different species will be competing for sunlight. If you've got a little plant underneath of a big tree, that little plant's going to be competing for sunlight, and the big tree is probably going to outcompete it. But it might still survive. Who knows? And then hiding spots, especially among prey animals. If you've got a rabbit and a squirrel in the same field, and there's only one hiding spot from the hawk that's circling above, they're going to compete for it. And they're going to shove whichever one loses out of that hiding spot, tell them to go find their own. This is like when you and your siblings play hide and seek from your dad after you're in trouble. Okay? If one's already in the closet, the other one says, no, you got to go somewhere else. Go get into the bed or something. Okay? And wild animals do this all the time among different species. So, species distributions. You should know about some species distribution. Here we have elephants. Elephants are clumped. Okay, so you can see there's lots of different clumps. It's not random. It's not uniform. Okay, they're just clumps all over the savanna. And these each represent different groups of elephants. Most mammals work in this way, where they clump up. Any social mammal will. Plants generally do not. Plants will either follow uniform or random. Okay, so uniform, here are the creosote bushes. These are out in the western United States. Their roots produce a toxin. So anywhere that there's roots, no other plant can grow. So around each of these plants, the roots go out in a circular fashion around each one. And that limits where they can grow. So they become uniform. So when you look out across the desert, you actually see they're exactly spread apart because of the root system that they have. And when one dies, then another seed will have to get into the right spot to grow. And then randomness, dandelions. Look out across anybody's lawn who doesn't, get rid of the dandelions, and they are completely random. Some grouped up really tight, some really far apart. It's all random. So animals will generally be clumped, and then plants can either be uniform or random depending on their specific biology and needs. So now, some more examples about interspecific competition. We have the competitive exclusion principle. That is that two species that have exactly the same requirements cannot coexist in the same habitat. So this is why it's called exclusion. Okay, it's either one or the other. No matter what, one is going to be excluded. And so if I have, if I have a deer and a boar, and they both eat the exact same food and need the exact same nutrients and need the exact same shelter and all that, they will not exist in the same forest. Okay. However, what will happen is that you'll have some difference in need. Okay, just a tiny bit of, even just a small difference. And this can lead to niche development. Okay. Niche development is, one species will begin to live up high in the trees and one will stay down low. Therefore, they've changed their space requirements. So now they can coexist, but they're competing a little bit differently. They've lost the competition for space out of their whole competitive web, I guess, and now they're maybe just competing for the same types of food. Okay? And so then they can coexist. So here's on the next slide I've got an example here with the common insect-eating warbler. A warbler is a type of bird, and resource partitioning. So when we go to the next slide, okay, these are all our warblers. They all have a little bit different color, okay, and they all live in the same types of trees, but the green part of the tree is where that particular warbler will live. And so you can see that this warbler lives only at the top, this one top or middle, this one the middle or a little bit into the center, this one center, and this one at the bottom. And by doing this, they share the same tree, they split up their resources, okay? They might all eat the same food, they might all eat pine needles for food, okay? But now they've separated out their space, they're not competing for hiding spots, because this one will always go to the top, this one will always go to the middle, okay, those sorts of things. And it helps them survive a little bit better and coexist in the same area. So now into our out of competition and into just interaction in general. Predation, one member eats another. Simple enough, okay? And of course, if you're going to not be eaten, you need to develop a defense against that. So you might get faster, you might develop camouflage, you might become poisonous, you might get horns, whatever it takes so that you don't get eaten. Okay, frogs puff up real big, so they're hard to swallow, and if you try and swallow them, you might choke and die yourself. That's their defense, So they're all sorts, and some are amusing, and some are definitely funny defenses. So now into symbiosis. Okay, symbiosis is just a relationship between two species living together. This is not necessarily predation. This is not like I'm eating you, and that's our relationship. This is like they actually live together for some period of time. All right, it might be short-lived, but they live together for some period of time. First is parasitism. One organism benefits, the other is harmed. These are your common blood-sucking insects and other weird things that you see. Okay, for example, a tapeworm. Okay, this is the head of a tapeworm. It latches onto your intestines, sucks away your nutrients and food. So you are losing nutrients, which you, in theory, worked really hard to get for if you hunted for it. So that is harmful to you, whereas a tapeworm continues to grow and get bigger, and so it is gaining. Ticks, of course, fleas, they're blood-sucking. They're taking nutrients from you so that they can get bigger. Mistletoe here grows on the branches and trunks of trees, and eventually it goes into the roots and steals nutrients. Okay, so mistletoe we like, in the winter, and we kiss under it and all that, but it's actually a parasite to plants, and this is pictures of mistletoe growing on a pine tree. Ants in Acadia. Okay, the Acadia tree doesn't have any natural defense, so the ants eat the plant seed, which secrete a chemical that protects the tree. So in this case, they're a little bit more of a different type of symbiosis. There, it's a mutualism. Okay, they're both working together to survive. So we've got all sorts of things. So let's go down here. We've got mutualism. Okay, this is the ant in the Acadia. each benefits from the other. So like I was saying, the acacia tree doesn't have a natural defense. The ants don't have a natural I guess they have a natural defense, but they don't have a way of getting food easily. So the acacia tree provides the food, the ants provide the defense. Mutualism. Buffalo and birds. The birds get some food by eating the parasites, and the buffalo get rid of the parasites. So they both benefit. Try and think of this one. What's the only natural mutualistic relationship involving humans? And it's not a dog. Dogs were domesticated, so therefore it's not natural. So what is the only natural mutualistic? And it is internal. Think of what goes on inside your body. I can answer that one in class. If you can't think of it, try not to Google it. Alright, types of symbiosis. Continued. Commensalism. One benefits, the other is not harmed. So we've got the rainforest epiphytes. It's a plant. Okay, it's these plants here. And what happens here is the trees, the really big rainforest trees, are growing. And then they have these areas where the branches meet, and it collects water and nutrients and other things. Well, the tree can't use those. It's just trapped in those branches. It doesn't, remember, the roots absorb all the water and nutrients, so it can't get anything from right there. What happens is that some seeds of other plants, in particular these fern-type plants, will get in there, and they will actually grow in those little pits of the branches. And so the fern benefits from the other tree, but the tree doesn't care. It's not harmed in any way. So that's commensalism. Try not to get mutualism and commensalism confused. Mutualism, both benefit. Commensalism, one benefits, one's not harmed. If one benefits and one is harmed, parasitism. Alright, so review. Okay, these are some questions you should be able to answer based on this video. If you cannot answer them, go back and re-watch the video. Okay, so list at least 3 places where species can be found. What are reasons that species live in certain areas? Okay, that's what I'm looking for there. It's one of the first slides. Explained island biogeography. Use a picture if you need to. Explain to me what a keystone species. I didn't necessarily give you a negative effect of invasive species, but I did tell you what an invasive species is, so try and think of a negative effect from a new species moving into an area. Species compete for R blank, so the word starts with an R, and we had a whole list of things like space and territory and food and whatnot. What do all of those constitute? And then what is the difference between mutualism and commensalism? Alright, so that's all for today. I hope you learned something. I hope you can answer these questions. And I hope not everything here was new, but rather a review of your basic ecology. So until next time, bye-bye.